Why is cultural appropriation a bad thing? Canada has been an interesting breeding ground for good work in the area of identity theory as it relates to multiculturalism and governance, so I will try to draw from that. Wilkimlicka, 1995, talks about there being two sorts of strict identities that shape all, but especially modern, people. The first is a sense of self, or I, which is defined by oneself and includes liberal values of individualism, but also cultural values defined by family and community. The second is other, identity pressures that are interacting with our self-identity. The challenge of a modern society, or any society, is to find a way to balance one's self-identity with broadly accepted communal identity. But what about when it clashes? What about a country where the majority is English-speaking, but a visible minority is French-speaking? Canada. Or what about this case, where a Czech community is defining how, culturally, members of their society should be performing their identities? Charles Taylor, 1994, talked about the same dialectic at play. There is a strong tendency to support one side or the other, a purely liberal recognition of all equality for individual, for example, or the communal recognition of a definition of performance and identity. Focusing on just one half will always result in a clash. E.g., by promoting pure liberalism, a majority rule of equal citizens can result in certain culturally unique traits being discriminated against, like the case of an English Canada that refuses to allow French Canada to have unique recognition. But this, predictably, results in anger from the minority group, which impacts their ability to live a meaningful life. Alternatively, giving in entirely to community-based definitions of identity can result in members of that very community feeling like their individual identity to choose how to live is being challenged. Taking it back to your case, I think we have a similar dynamic playing out. Your self-identity is being challenged by a community identity, even a majority identity, that is telling you how to live. At the same time, your self-identity to fall in love with someone of a different culture challenges their communal identity, creating a clash. Is cultural appropriation a bad thing? Absolutely not, but what it means is, until humanity has a global culture, which is on the rise, the communal cultures within it will always and predictably, at different scales, feel challenged by your unwillingness to conform. Does this suggest you should conform? Absolutely not. A modern multicultural society evolves to recognize that at times identities are challenged, but that it is through acceptance and public discourse that self-identity and communal identity can be recognized together. But what this does mean, in the long run, is communal identities will indeed face global cultural appropriation given the very nature of globalization, unless they close their borders and shut down their internet.
What is this?
The long-term trends of human development and the mixing of identities favors your arrangement, but in the short term and in specific contexts, your arrangement challenges communal identities that have not yet accommodated to the globalized world. Robinson, 2007, made a compelling case that you should not worry about what others think, because while yes, you are challenging their old-fashioned identity, you are simply pursuing a meaningful life that matters to you, such as by falling in love with someone, and clearly communal identity doesn't shape your identity as strongly as it does for some of your neighbors, by the fact you didn't even think of this until others raised it to you. They are threatened because their self as a communal group feels threatened, but your being with a Chinese man does not legitimately threaten their access to a meaningful life, while them telling you to conform is indeed threatening a meaningful life. In the clash of identities, modern societies err on the side of promoting that meaningful life, however it is defined, be it as a self-identity or communal identity, or both, but generally, preference should always be given to whatever identity, or adaptations, enables one to live a meaningful and happy life. Spin-off question: how do you distinguish between cultural appropriation and cultural exchange? The former is usually connoted negatively and the latter positively, but I have trouble telling them apart in the wild. I did find this book, and its first chapter is a good introduction to the theoretical base. As those authors point out, cultural appropriation is an enormous claim that many people use in different ways. As I read it, generally there is a concern that appropriation enriches the appropriator at the expense of the appropriated and a concern that appropriation violates some aspect of the integrity or dignity of a culture, e.g. the right to define itself. For example, imagine that your hair ornaments were imbued with great symbolic significance, e.g. religious meaning, like a cross or yarmulke. Now imagine that Walmart starts selling them as fashion accessories. Admittedly, they likely outsource their production to China, but bear with me. Some might find it disrespectful for you to wear something symbolic without any intent of adopting the symbol. After all, symbolic objects are only so because, collectively, we recognize them as symbolic. Refusing to promote that connection strips away some of that power. And, all the while, you're enriching an American corporation and not the people who traditionally make and wear those ornaments. Your argument about all cultures being syncretic is, I think, a decent counterargument, but it, absent more, fails to engage the counterarguments that A, regardless of the origin, the object is now a culture's property, and you can't just take it and B, simply because it's been done that way in the past doesn't mean it was done ethically. The past is full of wholesale slaughter, rape, theft, and forced assimilation. I have a question myself. Is it also a cultural appropriation if a member of a minority group dons something of the majority group without understanding? For example, an Asian American child wears a Red Sox jersey yet has never heard of them before and is generally unknowledgeable about American sports culture. And what about a cultural appropriation, but within the same race of the same country? Is it just as bad if a white person from Boston dons a cowboy hat yet has never been to the South? If someone from the city wears something that only exists in one random small American suburb that has some unique history? Is it cultural appropriation if an American guy buys Uniqlo clothing, a lifewear brand that commodifies a Japanese culture? Is it cultural appropriation if a Japanese guy worships LL Bean? Edit, I think I just made myself realize the horror of commodity fetishism. I wouldn't necessarily call what you're talking about cultural appropriation, at least not in the implicitly negative manner that those Americans you're dealing with are talking about. You are, I'm assuming, invited to or, at least, allowed to participate in your boyfriend's culture by his family, instead of outright co-opting it. Your context is different, and I'm assuming your critics don't know this full context, either. Bashing you for cultural appropriation is tricky, because in practice outside of academia, I find cultural appropriation to almost always refer to uninvited co-opting of other cultures, and I don't see that in what little I know of your case. That is not to say that all concerns are automatically invalid, e.g., your BF may not actually understand the cultural significance of certain items, but your situation is at least appropriate within the company that you keep. That said, you could find examples of permitted appropriation, such as is highly common with ceremonies and curios from exotic tourist destinations, but that's another can of worms in itself. Scafides who owns culture? 2005 Rutgers University Press is full of such categorizations and debates.